Navigating ought to avoid these common mistakes. Hello, English learners. Today, we're focusing on an essential modal verb, ought to. In our previous lessons, we covered should, had better, and their uses for giving advice. Now, let's unravel the complexities of ought to and clear up some common mistakes. By the end of this video, you'll be more confident in using ought to appropriately and effectively. Ought to is a modal verb we use to indicate duty or correctness, much like should. It often expresses expectation or an ideal state. Here's an example. You ought to read the instructions before starting. One common mistake is using ought to in the past tense as oughted to. Remember, ought to doesn't have a past form. You can't say, I oughted to call him. Instead, you'd say, I should have called him. When making negative statements with ought to, people often get confused. Here's the rule. We use ought not to or oughtn't to for negatives. For example, you ought not to ignore your health, or he oughtn't to have spoken like that. A common mistake here is using ought to not or ought not. Please avoid these forms. Stick to ought not to or oughtn't to. Using ought to in questions can be tricky, as well. The correct way is, ought I to do it? But in informal language, we typically just use should. The phrase, should I do it, is much more common in everyday conversation. A common mistake is using ought to at the beginning of a question, like, ought to I do it? This is incorrect. Remember, the subject should come after ought. And that's a wrap for today's lesson on ought to. Remember, the key to mastering these modals is practice, practice, practice. Make sure to use ought to in your daily conversations, and be mindful of these common mistakes. In time, using ought to will feel just as natural as any other English modal verb. Keep learning, and see you in the next video.